Iran said the Strait of Hormuz was closed. That was the sentence designed to freeze the world. Not just freeze diplomats, not just freeze oil traders. Freeze every government that depends on the narrow blue throat between Iran and Oman, where tankers carry the lifeblood of the global economy. But then the United States answered with something more dangerous than a speech. In numbers. About 20 million barrels of oil, according to U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, exited through Hormuz in a single 24-hour period. Around 72 ships moved. Oil prices fell. The claim of closure started to look less like a wall and more like a warning shot that did not fully land. Now pause there. Because the public debate is asking the wrong question. The question is not simply whether Iran can close Hormuz. Everyone knows Iran can make Hormuz dangerous. Everyone knows mines, missiles, drones, naval harassment, insurance costs, and fear can turn that waterway into a pressure chamber. The real question is sharper. Can Iran still make the world believe that Hormuz belongs to Tehran? That is the psychological battlefield, not the sea, not the tanker lane, the belief. Iran wanted the world to look at Hormuz and see a switch. One flip from Tehran and energy markets panic. One warning from Tehran and Washington bends. One closure claim and every capital from Washington to Tokyo begins counting barrels like oxygen tanks. But Washington looked at that same switch and tried to rip it out of the wall. That is what this crisis is really about. I want you to look at the timing. On June 17, the Associated Press described an initial U.S.-Iran deal meant to stop the war, ease some sanctions pressure, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and create a 60-day window for nuclear talks. That deal was not small. It was not symbolic. It involved oil, sanctions, shipping, nuclear inspections, and the question of whether Iran could sell its crude more freely again. Then, only days later, Iran said the strait would not reopen because the Lebanon part of the arrangement was not being respected. That is not a coincidence. That is a bargaining table disguised as a shipping crisis. Iran was not just saying, we control this water. Iran was saying, if you want this water to behave normally, you must also deal with Lebanon, Hezbollah, sanctions, oil revenue, and our place in the regional order. Hormuz became a hostage note written in the language of energy markets. But here is the part they do not want to explain. If Hormuz was truly closed, why were tankers still moving? If Iran had fully locked the gate, why was Washington able to point to oil flows close to normal within days? If Tehran's leverage was absolute, why did the fight immediately shift from closed or open to how many ships, how many barrels, which route, under whose protection? That shift matters. A closed strait is a strategic earthquake. A dangerous strait is a negotiation. Iran wanted the first image. The United States tried to force the second. This is where the official story begins to crack. Iran's public message was built on fear. America's response was built on logistics. And in geopolitics, logistics is often the moment when theater dies. Because a threat survives only as long as the other side cannot route around it, escort through it, insure against it, measure it, or expose it. When Washington said roughly 20 million barrels moved through Hormuz in 24 hours, it was not just talking to Iran. It was talking to oil markets. It was talking to allies. It was talking to shipping companies. It was talking to every capital, wondering whether Tehran still had the ability to shut down 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. The message was simple. The gate is not locked. But I do not want to make this too simple, because that would be dishonest. Iran did not completely fail. Reuters also reported that hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors were stuck in the Gulf, and that vessel movement had not returned to the pre-war average. Traffic rising to more than 25 ships a day is not the same as the old rhythm of roughly 125 ships a day before the war. That gap is not a footnote. That gap is the truth hiding between two propaganda lines. Iran could not fully close Hormuz, but the United States could not make it instantly normal either. That is the gray zone, and the gray zone is where modern power lives. Think of Hormuz like a doorway in a burning building. Iran did not need to brick it shut. It only needed to fill the hallway with smoke, make everyone question whether the floor was mined, and force every person inside to move slower. America did not need to make the building safe. It only needed to prove people could still get through the door. That is the contest. Not closure versus openness. Fear versus movement. Now let me put a model on the table. I call it the straight illusion model. In this model, a strategic choke point has 3 layers. The first layer is physical control. Can you block ships? Can you mine water? Can you hit tankers? Can you threaten naval escorts? The second layer is market control. Can you make insurers raise prices? Can you make traders bid up oil? Can you make shipping companies pause even before a missile is fired? The third layer is narrative control. Can you make the world believe your hand is on the throat of the system? Iran's mistake was treating all 3 layers as if they were the same. They are not. You can threaten the physical route without fully controlling it. You can disturb the market without owning the outcome. You can dominate the headline for 24 hours and still lose the narrative when the barrels move. That is what happened here. Iran tried to turn Hormuz into a symbol of unstoppable leverage. The United States tried to turn it into a solvable operational problem. Escorts, alternate lanes, mine clearing, diplomatic pressure, and public data. The question is not what they said, the question is what they moved. And what moved was oil. That does not mean the danger disappeared. It means the American response was designed to break the spell. Every geopolitical threat depends on imagination. A missile is dangerous because of what it can hit. A sanction is dangerous because of what it can slowly starve. A choke point is dangerous because every trader, captain, insurer, and minister imagines the same nightmare at the same time. Iran wanted that nightmare synchronized. Washington tried to desynchronize it. That is why Chris Wright's numbers mattered. The 20 million barrels were not just barrels. They were an argument. The 72 ships were not just ships. They were a counter-speech. The falling oil price was not just a market reaction. It was a public vote against panic. But follow the money, then follow the fear. Because the United States did not call Iran's bluff for free. According to AP, the initial agreement involved sanctions waivers that could allow Iran to sell oil more freely during the 60-day window. AP described that as a major concession, possibly even one that weakened Washington's leverage. That is crucial. If America truly believed Iran had no leverage, why offer relief? If Washington had completely neutralized terms, why give Tehran an economic path back into the oil market? The answer is uncomfortable. Because Iran's bluff was not empty, it was exaggerated. There is a difference. An empty bluff has no force behind it. An exaggerated bluff has enough force to scare the table, but not enough to own the game. Iran could not shut Hormuz like flipping a switch. But Iran could make the cost of keeping Hormuz open rise sharply. That cost could come in naval deployments, insurance premiums, diplomatic concessions, oil waivers, mine clearing operations, or political pressure on allies. That is why this story is more complex than a simple American victory lap. Yes, Washington challenged the claim. Yes, tankers moved. Yes, the market calmed. But the very existence of a deal involving oil waivers tells you Iran still had something Washington wanted to diffuse. Sanctions are not a wall. They are a slow tightening belt around the ribs of a state. Iran wanted that belt loosened. Hormuz was the hand reaching for the buckle. And Lebanon was the other hand. That is the next layer. Reuters reported that Iran tied the Hormuz issue to Lebanon and the ceasefire involving Hezbollah. That means Tehran was not treating Hormuz as an isolated maritime issue. It was using the strait as connective tissue between multiple pressure points: oil sanctions, Hezbollah, Israel, U.S. military threats, and nuclear talks. This is how regional power actually works. As a bundle of crises tied together until no one can pull one thread without tightening another. Iran was telling Washington, you cannot separate the waterway from Lebanon. You cannot separate Lebanon from Hezbollah. You cannot separate Hezbollah from Israel. You cannot separate Israel from the war. You cannot separate the war from sanctions. And you cannot separate sanctions from nuclear negotiations. That is a chain. America's strategy was to cut the chain at the most visible link, Hormuz. If Hormuz remains usable, Iran's ability to connect every issue to the same global panic weakens. That is why the U.S. response was not just military or economic, it was psychological. Washington needed to show that Iran could create danger but not dictate reality. Look at the timing again. The AP report on the initial deal came June 17. The Reuters reports on renewed Hormuz tensions came June 20 and 21. The U.S. claim of restored oil flows came June 24. That is not a slow-moving crisis. That is a compressed strategic duel. In 1 week, Hormuz moved from agreement to threat to disputed closure to partial reopening to market relief. A week. And inside that week, every side tried to shape the meaning of the same waterway. Iran wanted Hormuz to mean leverage. America wanted Hormuz to mean resilience. Markets wanted Hormuz to mean price. Shipping companies wanted Hormuz to mean risk. Israel likely viewed Hormuz through another lens entirely. Whether a U.S.-Iran deal would reduce pressure on Tehran and weaken Israel's strategic position after months of conflict. That is why this cannot be understood as a shipping story. Hormuz was the scoreboard of the war. When oil moved, Washington scored. When ships hesitated, Tehran scored. When sanctions waivers entered the deal, Tehran scored. When prices fell, Washington scored. When mine fears forced escorts and altered routes, Iran scored. When the strait did not fully close, Washington scored again. This is not chess. Chess is too clean. This is a knife fight inside an engine room. Every movement changes pressure somewhere else. Now let's examine the first machine inside this crisis, energy. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a line on a map. It is a valve in the body of the global economy. At around 20 million barrels per day in 2024, roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. IEA has also emphasized its importance for global LNG, especially exports from Qatar and the UAE. That means every threat to Hormuz is a threat to far more than gasoline prices. It touches electricity, shipping costs, fertilizer, petrochemicals, inflation expectations, central bank pressure, and political approval ratings. Oil is never just oil. Oil is food prices wearing a different mask. Oil is election pressure under another name. Oil is the invisible tax that appears when a tanker captain decides not to sail. So when Iran says Hormuz is closed, the target is not only Washington. The target is every government that fears inflation more than it admits. That is why the United States had to answer quickly. A delayed answer would have allowed panic to harden into market behavior. Once insurers price fear, once traders price disruption, once shipping companies reroute, the political damage begins even if no ship is sunk. Fear does not need confirmation to become expensive. This is the hidden power of a choke point. Iran did not need to prove total control. It needed to introduce doubt. America did not need to prove total safety. It needed to interrupt doubt before it became a new price floor. That is why the 20 million barrel figure mattered so much. It was a firebreak. It told the market, do not build the next week around Iranian control. But again, the fire was not gone. Reuters reported continuing mine concerns, military escort routes, and the possibility that full normalization could take weeks. That tells you the sea itself was still speaking a language of danger. A normal strait does not need reassurance. A normal strait does not need warships to prove it is open. A normal strait does not force the world to debate whether 25 ships a day means recovery or paralysis. So when U.S. officials said flows were close to normal, we should hear both the truth and the political need inside that sentence. The truth. Oil was moving. On the need, panic had to be contained. Now let's examine the second machine, sanctions. AP's reporting on the initial deal is one of the most important parts of this story because it shows what Iran was actually trying to win. Not just prestige, not just a headline, oil revenue. Iran's economy depends heavily on the ability to sell crude. AP noted that Iranian oil export revenue in 2024 exceeded $46 billion. That is not symbolic money. That is regime oxygen. Sanctions are designed to deny that oxygen. So when the agreement included waivers allowing Iran to sell oil more freely, this was not a side detail. It was a central prize. The public stage was Hormuz. The private prize was revenue. Here's the part they do not want to explain. If Iran was only acting irrationally, why did the pressure point align so neatly with the economic concession? Iran tied the waterway to oil waivers because the waterway is the threat, but oil sales are the reward. Dangerous, yes. Escalatory, yes. But not random. A state under pressure uses the tools it has. Iran's tool was disruption. America's tool was containment. The deal became the place where those tools collided. This is why the phrase called the bluff must be used carefully. Washington called the bluff at the level of total closure. But Tehran may still have extracted value at the level of negotiated relief. A bluff can fail on television and still work at the negotiating table. That is the uncomfortable lesson. And this is where many commentators get it wrong. They want a clean winner, they want America humiliated or Iran humiliated, they want a single headline that settles the matter. But geopolitics rarely gives you clean winners. It gives you trade-offs. America wanted Hormuz open, Iran wanted oil revenue, Israel wanted Iran contained, Gulf states wanted stability without becoming targets, Asian importers wanted energy flows, shipping companies wanted risk clarity. Everyone wanted something. Nobody wanted to admit the price. An alliance is not a family photo. It is a room full of countries pretending not to count the knives. That applies here. The United States may have led the response, but every ally had different fears. Some feared Iran, some feared oil prices, some feared escalation, some feared a deal that lets Tehran breathe, some feared a war that closes the sea. This is why Hormuz becomes so powerful. It forces hidden priorities into the open. If you care most about containing Iran, you may dislike sanctions relief. If you care most about keeping oil flowing, you may tolerate relief. If you care most about regional deterrence, you may want military pressure. If you care most about avoiding recession, you want tankers moving yesterday. The strait reveals everyone. Now let's examine the third machine, military credibility. Trump's threat to strike Iran harder if Tehran failed to restrain Hezbollah created a brutal contrast with Vance's diplomatic language about turning a new page. On one side, negotiation. On the other side, punishment. That contradiction is not accidental. It is a pressure tactic. The United States was saying, we can talk, but we can also hit. We can offer waivers, but we can also escort ships. We can give Iran a diplomatic exit, but we will not let Tehran write the maritime rules alone. This dual message is risky. Too much diplomacy and allies question deterrence. Too much threat and Iran may escalate to prove it is not intimidated. Too much concession and Israel may feel boxed out. Too much pressure and energy markets panic again. That is the balance Washington tried to walk. The real American move was not just to dispute Iran's claim. It was to dispute Iran's authority to define reality. When Iran said closed, Washington answered, look at the ships. When Iran tried to connect Hormuz to Lebanon, Washington answered, we will negotiate, but the water must move. When Iran relied on fear, Washington relied on flow. And in this kind of crisis, flow is power. A country that can keep energy moving through a threatened choke point sends a message far beyond the water. It tells allies, we can protect the system. It tells enemies, your threat is costly but not decisive. It tells markets, do not surrender to the headline. That was the American play. But there is danger here too. Because once you publicly call a bluff, you cannot afford to be wrong. If Washington says Hormuz is open and then a tanker is hit, the credibility damage is severe. If officials say flows are normal and shipping data shows hesitation, the market will punish the overstatement. If America claims Iran has lost its leverage, and then Washington grants more oil relief, critics will say Tehran forced concessions anyway. Calling a bluff is not just an action, it is a bet. Washington bet that Iran would avoid full closure, because full closure would be extremely dangerous for Iran too. That is a key point. Iran depends on the Gulf as well. Iran's own oil exports, regional relationships, and economic survival are not helped by a permanent naval crisis that brings overwhelming U.S. pressure and possibly broader retaliation. Closing Hormuz completely is not like locking your enemy out of a room. It is like setting fire to a hallway you also need to escape through. Iran knows this. That is why the threat of closure can be more useful than closure itself. The threat creates bargaining power. Total closure creates uncontrollable escalation. This is the logic behind the bluff. Iran wanted maximum fear with controlled risk. America tried to force the risk higher and the fear lower. That is how you call this kind of bluff. Not by pretending danger does not exist, but by making the opponent choose between a symbolic threat and an actual escalation they may not be ready to sustain. Now pause there. Because there is a strong counter-argument, and we need to treat it seriously. This America did not call Iran's bluff. America paid Iran to step back. That argument is not foolish. Smart people can believe it because AP reported sanctions waivers and freer oil sales for Iran as part of the early agreement. If Tehran gained access to more oil revenue, then maybe Hormuz worked exactly as intended. Maybe Iran did not need to close the strait. Maybe it only needed to scare Washington enough to loosen sanctions. That is a serious argument. It also explains why some regional actors would be furious. If Iran can threaten Hormuz, tie it to Lebanon, and then walk away with oil relief, then the lesson is dangerous. Threaten the valve, win concessions. So why do I still say Washington called the bluff? Because the evidence does not show Iran achieved full narrative control. It shows Iran created disruption, but not obedience. The strait did not remain closed. Oil flowed, prices fell. U.S. officials publicly denied Iran's claim and backed that denial with movement. Shipping was damaged, delayed, and rerouted, but not frozen into strategic surrender. Iran may have extracted economic concessions, but it failed to prove that it alone could decide whether Hormuz lived or died. That distinction matters. A successful hostage-taker controls the room. Iran controlled the panic for a moment. The United States then forced the room to watch the door open. That does not erase Iran's leverage. It limits it. And limiting leverage is often the real victory in crisis management. Here is another counter-argument. Maybe the U.S. numbers were political spin. Maybe 20 million barrels in one 24-hour window does not prove sustained normal flow. Maybe some of those barrels came from delayed ships exiting in a burst. Maybe total traffic remained far below pre-war norms. Maybe the market calmed too quickly. That argument is also fair. In fact, Reuters reporting on hundreds of ships and reduced traffic supports caution. The United States had every reason to frame the situation optimistically. Energy officials are not neutral observers during an energy panic. Their words are part of the stabilization campaign. But even if the numbers were chosen for maximum reassurance, they still had an effect. Markets respond not only to perfect truth, but to credible signals. If traders believed Hormuz was not fully shut, prices could fall. If ship owners saw military escorts and evacuation plans, some traffic could resume. If allies saw Washington moving, they had less reason to panic publicly. In crisis, perception becomes infrastructure. A convoy is physical infrastructure. A price signal is psychological infrastructure. A government statement is narrative infrastructure. Together, they can keep a system from collapsing. That is what Washington built. Not safety. Continuity. And continuity was enough to wound Iran's message. This is where the official story begins to crack in a different direction. Because both sides needed exaggeration. Iran needed to exaggerate control. America needed to exaggerate normalization. Tehran wanted the world to see a locked gate. Washington wanted the world to see an open highway. The truth was between them. A dangerous corridor under pressure, still moving because too many powerful actors could not afford to let it stop. That truth is less dramatic than the propaganda, but more important. Hormuz did not prove Iran was omnipotent. It did not prove America was invulnerable. It proved that the global economy is held together by force, fear, insurance, diplomacy, and ships moving through narrow water under the shadow of missiles. That is not stability. That is managed fragility. And managed fragility can break. Now let's talk about Israel, because ignoring Israel would make the analysis incomplete. AP noted that a U.S.-Iran deal could be a major setback for Netanyahu. That makes sense. If Washington relaxes pressure on Iran in exchange for maritime stability and nuclear talks, Israel may see its strategic room shrinking. Israel's priority is not necessarily cheap oil. Israel's priority is containing Iran, Hezbollah, and the regional networks surrounding it. So when Hormuz is tied to Lebanon, this is not just an Iran-America issue. It touches Israel's security doctrine directly. Iran's message was, Lebanon is part of the price. America's message was, keep the water moving. Israel's concern may be, do not trade regional pressure for energy calm. That triangle matters. Because the next crisis may not come from the strait itself. It may come from a party that believes the deal surrounding the strait gives too much away. That is how ceasefires crack, not only from enemies rejecting them, but from allies feeling trapped by them. Look at the timing. If U.S.-Iran talks continue while Hezbollah tensions remain unresolved, every incident in Lebanon becomes a potential Hormuz trigger. Every Israeli strike, every militia response, every disputed ceasefire violation can be pulled back into the shipping lane. That is the danger of linked crises. Once you connect the wires, any spark can travel. Iran connected Hormuz to Lebanon. If that linkage becomes accepted, Tehran gains a reusable mechanism. Pressure here, concession there. Washington's challenge is to break that mechanism without blowing up the talks. That is much harder than sending escorts through a strait. Military escorts can move ships. They cannot easily untangle strategic blackmail from diplomacy. This is where the next 48 to 72 hours become critical. Not watch speeches first. Watch movement. First, watch AIS and independent tanker tracking. If traffic continues rising toward pre-war patterns, Iran's closure narrative weakens further. If traffic stalls again, especially outside normal weather or scheduling patterns, then the fear premium returns. Second, watch insurance and freight rates for Gulf transit. Prices can reveal fear before officials admit it. If war risk premiums stay elevated, then the market is telling you the strait is open only because everyone is paying extra to pretend it is normal. Third, watch whether the U.S.-Iran 60-day framework produces visible sanctions waivers, IAEA access steps, or Lebanon-related enforcement language. If oil relief moves faster than security guarantees, Iran may have extracted more value than Washington wants to admit. If verification moves first, Washington regains leverage. Those are the three indicators. Not slogans, not speeches, movement, pricing, and enforcement. That is where the truth will show itself. Because in geopolitics, official language is often smoke. The ships are footprints. And now we return to the title. Iran said Hormuz was closed. The U.S. called the bluff. That line is powerful because it captures one layer of the truth. Iran did make a claim that the United States publicly challenged. Oil did move. The market did calm. The image of Iran holding the global economy hostage was damaged. But the deeper story is more dangerous. America did not prove Hormuz was harmless. It proved Hormuz could be kept alive under pressure. Iran did not prove it owned the strait. It proved it could make the cost of normal life rise. That is the difference between dominance and disruption. Iran may not control the world's energy valve, but it can still make the hand that protects the valve tremble. And the United States may still protect the system. But every time it has to do so with escorts, waivers, emergency coordination, and public reassurance, the world sees how fragile the system really is. This is the lesson. The modern global economy is not protected by peace. It is protected by managed danger. A tanker moves because a navy signals. A price falls because a minister speaks. A deal survives because adversaries decide, for now, that escalation costs more than restraint. A narrow strait remains open because no one can afford the truth of it closing. That should disturb you. Because the next time Iran reaches for Hormuz, the question will not be whether the bluff is real. The question will be whether the world still believes America can call it without paying a higher price. And maybe that is the real philosophical question left behind by this crisis. If a global system can be shaken by a sentence, stabilized by a statistic, and held open by warships, was it ever truly stable at all?